Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tommy O'Brien, coming to you live from TFNN. We kick things off with markets green across the board right now. We've pulled back from the highs, though. S&Ps, we're up by 0.8%. You're trading up 53 points. We had an inflation data point this morning. Markets were already in the green by about 30 points when we came into that inflation data point. You accelerated higher from there. Where do we come back? You test that area, and we've popped a bit. As you have the S&Ps right now up by 52 points, trading at 68.31. NASDAQ 100 up by 367 points. You see the acceleration on the inflation data this morning from about 25,100. We're trading up 1.5%. Growth stocks higher. How about Micron? Up by 12% on their numbers. You jump over to NVIDIA shares. Up by a solid 2% right now. Amazon up by 2.25%. Microsoft shares 1.75%, and they're $5 off of the highs. You jump over to Google, up by 1.9%. Meta shares 2.2%. Oracle was higher, up by 0.7%. Dow lagging a bit, only up by about 100 points. That's 0.2%. The Dow is up above 48,700 this morning. You talk about a run. That was 500 points. That was a 1% decline from 11:30 until about 12:30 when we got some selling in this market. Now, let's jump over to the inflation data. Excuse me, because right now we have the 10-year yield pushing 4.12%. Take a look at the dollar before we jump over. Your dollar spikes to 98.20 this morning. The premise being you got higher price, lower yield. The Fed has the ability to cut. They're not as worried about inflation. Then we recoil a bit. Now, getting into this data, we live in interesting times, as they say, and we sure do, folks. So we do not get the October data. And we get the November data. But remember, the government was shut down until about November 12th, okay? Now, a bunch of articles reference it. We'll talk about it. One of the Bloomberg articles coming up as well. But where they had no data, they assumed 0% inflation. Now, there is political creep in these numbers, and hopefully this is a one-off that they're not going to be able to make these types of assumptions because it's a gross assumption on the side of a downward bias. And what this bias is, okay, is that you have many areas of the CPI. So the headline number for CPI, okay, comes in at 2.7%. Core CPI comes in at that we're looking for, which was 3.1 for the headline and 3% for the core. Great numbers, okay? Now, this data was delayed. It was a jobs Tuesday. This time, it was a CPI overall. Owner's equivalent rent. Okay, this is what's getting focused in on. Now, owner's equivalent rent doesn't get used to calculate. If that's the only thing being a problem, but it's a problem, okay? And that's been one of the persistent parts. Put in zero inflation in multiple categories while calculating the OER, the owner's equivalent rent, for approximately 1/3 of the cities used. To the extent that it introduces a downward bias, the Fed would be mindful of the risk of taking the data on housing services inflation at face value. This weakness should be reversed with very large owner's equivalent rent and tenant rent increases in the April CPI released in May. But until then, the price levels for owner's equivalent rent and tenant's rent will be biased downward. Now, I'm not sure why they pushed that out until May, okay, or how that calculation gets in there. But this is just CNBC talking about it. And, yeah, the government was out for half a month, so hopefully that's the only time it happens. But it seems like they're light on data, and when they're light on data, they're putting out a full November number, and they're just leaving the numbers at 0% for some of those components that they weren't able to get a reputable number. Now, the other part of this that they talk about is the fact that we had Black Friday sales. Okay, now normally they account for this. Officials were not able to collect prices in the field for the shutdown that lasted until November 12th. Black Friday sales, okay, the BLS uses a seasonal adjustment to correct for that trend. But the problem is that how do you correct for it when the government was shut down for like 6 weeks leading up to it? The seasonal adjustment is designed for a normal November when workers spend weeks collecting prices before those sales begin, and they can factor that in and make an adjustment. How are you going to make an adjustment when you have no data? But then we're jumping to the Journal, okay? The Journal makes the same case. They talk about Black Friday, and then they say an even bigger issue is that missing October data likely made November housing cost increases look milder than they actually are. Unfortunate that you got to, if you're making a real-world assessment, the number's probably greater than zero, or it's explained within, but it's just left at zero. It brings down the headline numbers. It helps explain the possible beat. But unfortunately, we're left with the fact that it may not reflect the actuality of the data going on when they just push a zero over where they have no data because the government was shut down. So the market taking it in stride. Fed's still going to be worried about the economy, but it may give them some pause to look at that inflation data and trust the owner's equivalent rent when there's a zero getting pushed across columns from a lack of data in many cities. Economists believe the missing data led the BLS's formula to assume that housing prices did not increase at all in October. A zero pushed down estimated rent levels in November as well. Well, if that's the case, that's great. But no data does not mean a 0% data. The market, quite the sell-off intraday, but not in growth stocks. We jump around to the heat map for the NASDAQ 100. How about that chart, man? Look at Micron. We'll jump into Micron. Boy, their quarter, we'll talk about it coming up next segment. Micron's quarter coming up. Whew, talk about blowing it away. And Tesla pushing the highs yet again. Everything. Look at Lam Research up by 7%. Clack up by 4.5%. Marvel up by 3.3%. Palantir up another 5% as well. You jump over to the Dow. Yeah, consumer staples, not so much. Walmart off by 0.7%. Home Depot off by 0.5%. Procter & Gamble 1.4%. United Health off by 1.2%. Apple in the red as well. All right, folks, stay tuned. We'll come back. We'll talk some Micron earnings. Micron pushing highs up by 12%. We'll come right back, folks.